Somewhere inside the Pentagon right now, a set of military plans is sitting ready, waiting on a single trigger. Not a vague contingency buried in a filing cabinet. A live, standing directive confirmed publicly by the President of the United States himself, tied to a growing list of specific actions that Iran has been explicitly warned not to take. Cross this line, and the response will not be measured. It will not be proportional. According to Trump's own words, it will be overwhelming. The question the entire region is now asking is simple. What exactly is this that Trump is warning about, and how close has Iran already come to triggering it? Let's start with what Trump has actually said, because the warnings have been stacking up fast, and each one adds a new trigger to the list. At the NATO summit in Ankara, after declaring the ceasefire with Iran finished, he told reporters he believed himself to be Iran's #1 target. Days later, in an interview with the New York Post, he confirmed he had already left instructions for the U.S. military to respond with overwhelming force if anything happened to him personally. Around the same time, after reports surfaced of an active Iranian assassination plot, he threatened publicly to decimate and destroy the entire country if that plot were carried out. And separately, in a Fox News interview, he warned that American forces would target Iranian infrastructure directly within the week if diplomatic negotiations failed to resume. This is not one warning. This is at least 4 distinct red lines, laid out publicly, one after another, each carrying its own version of the same underlying threat. To understand why this matters so much right now, you need to see how quickly the ceasefire that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of escalation actually collapsed. In mid-June, Washington and Tehran signed a 14-point memorandum, releasing Iran's naval blockade, reopening the Strait of Hormuz, and opening a 60-day window for a permanent settlement. It held for weeks. Then, Iranian forces struck 3 commercial vessels near Oman, including a Qatari gas tanker. The United States responded with strikes on Iranian military targets. Iran answered by launching missiles and drones at American bases across the Gulf. Trump declared the ceasefire over. Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz entirely. And, in the days since, American forces have carried out strike after strike, hitting close to 90 Iranian military targets in a single recent night alone, using precision munitions against command centers, air defense sites, and coastal surveillance facilities, specifically aimed at restoring freedom of navigation through the strait. This is the wreckage sitting behind every one of Trump's warnings. A ceasefire that took months to negotiate, reduced to trading blows within days. And now, layered on top of that collapse, an entirely separate category of threat has emerged. One tied not to shipping lanes or military bases, but to Trump's own life. According to his own account, he has been on Iran's target list for a long time. That detail changes the entire nature of this conflict. This is no longer simply a war over nuclear ambitions and control of a shipping choke point. It has become, in Trump's own telling, a war where the American president himself is a named specific target, and where the promised response to that specific threat has already been drafted and is waiting to be executed. Now picture what overwhelming force has already meant in practice during this exact conflict, because the phrase is not abstract. Back in the war's opening days, American and Israeli strikes hit more than 5,000 targets across Iran within the first 10 days alone, destroying dozens of naval vessels and killing the country's supreme leader in the process. That is the baseline this specific war has already established for what overwhelming force looks like. If any of Trump's stated triggers, an assassination attempt, continued closure of Hormuz, further attacks on American infrastructure or personnel, are actually crossed, the response being described is not a symbolic escalation. It is a campaign explicitly framed as dwarfing even the most intense strikes this war has already produced. This is exactly the trap sitting underneath this entire moment. Because Iran's own newly installed leadership cannot simply back away from every one of these flashpoints without looking weak to the hardline factions that installed them in the first place. Iran's Supreme National Security Council has separately warned that Iran is prepared to drag Israel back into this fight if American strikes continue. Iran's Revolutionary Guard has warned it will expand retaliation to additional American bases across the region if Washington keeps striking. And Iran's own new Supreme Leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, installed under intense wartime pressure just weeks ago, specifically because he was expected to project defiance rather than compromise, has declared publicly that revenge is the will of the nation. Trump is threatening overwhelming force in response to lines Iran's own government appears politically unable to avoid crossing. Let's widen the lens, because Trump's list of triggers connects to almost every major flashpoint currently shaping this war. Start with the Strait of Hormuz itself, because it may be the single most immediate and combustible trigger on Trump's list. Trump has been explicit that his anger over the strait not being fully reopened factored directly into his decision to authorize further strikes, according to a U.S. official familiar with the discussions. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil and gas once moved through that narrow waterway before this war began strangling the flow. Iran's decision to shut the strait entirely, rather than simply threatening it as it has in past rounds of this conflict, represents by far the most direct economic weapon Tehran still has available. Every day that waterway remains closed adds pressure on Trump to follow through on his warning that American forces will target Iranian infrastructure directly if negotiations do not resume, a threat aimed specifically at breaking Iran's leverage over global oil markets by force rather than through continued diplomatic pressure. Now bring in the infrastructure threat specifically, because it represents an entirely different category of escalation than anything seen earlier in this war. Trump's warning that American strikes would target key Iranian infrastructure within the week, delivered in a Fox News interview, moves well beyond hitting military assets like air defense systems and naval vessels. Infrastructure targeting implies strikes against the systems that keep a country's economy and civilian life functioning, power grids, ports, transportation networks, the kind of targets that produce far greater civilian impact than strikes confined to military installations. Iran's own government has already warned it would crush key regional targets if this specific threat is carried out. Language suggesting Tehran views infrastructure strikes as crossing into a fundamentally different, more dangerous category of warfare than the military exchanges that have defined this conflict so far. Then there is the assassination threat, sitting apart from every other trigger on this list because of how personal it is. A war fought over nuclear ambitions and shipping lanes operates under one set of political and legal justifications. A war explicitly framed as retaliation for an attempted presidential assassination operates under a completely different one, both for how the American public understands the stakes and for how international observers judge the proportionality of whatever response follows. Trump's decision to publicly confirm standing military orders tied specifically to his own life adds a uniquely volatile trigger to a conflict that already had plenty of them, one that removes any ambiguity about how personally this war has become for the man directing America's side of it. Now consider Israel's position layered on top of all of this, because Trump is not the only actor in this conflict issuing readiness warnings right now. Israel's defense minister has separately declared his country ready to re-engage militarily at any time and against any threat, a statement that Iran's own officials have explicitly linked to potential retaliation for continued American strikes. This means Trump's warnings are not operating in isolation. Every trigger on his list carries the added risk of pulling Israel back into active combat as well, transforming what might otherwise be a two-party escalation between Washington and Tehran into a simultaneous, multi-front regional war involving Israel, Lebanon, and potentially additional Gulf states already absorbing spillover fire from this conflict. There's also a useful way to think about why Trump chose to stack multiple public triggers rather than issuing one single unified warning, because the strategy behind it reflects a specific, if risky, theory of deterrence. A single, narrow threat is easier for an adversary to specifically avoid, but it also leaves every other form of escalation seemingly permitted by omission. By publicly naming several distinct triggers, the Strait of Hormuz, infrastructure strikes, attacks on American bases, and any threat to his own life, Trump appears to be attempting to close off every plausible avenue of continued Iranian escalation simultaneously rather than allowing Tehran to test the boundaries of American tolerance one category of provocation at a time. The risk, as with any broad deterrence strategy, is that casting too wide a net makes the threat harder to enforce consistently. And adversaries have historically been quick to notice when a stated red line goes unenforced, treating that gap as evidence the entire threat lacks teeth. Now consider how Gulf allies are actually responding to this stacking list of American warnings beyond simply bracing for spillover fire. Defense procurement conversations already underway across Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE have reportedly accelerated further in recent weeks, driven in large part by the recognition that any of Trump's stated triggers being crossed could produce a dramatically larger American military response than anything seen in this war so far. Missile defense systems, expanded troop rotations, and closer real-time intelligence sharing with Washington are all becoming more urgent priorities for governments who have no direct influence over whether Iran crosses any of these specific lines, yet remain firmly inside the blast radius if it does. There is also the question of how international observers and legal analysts are likely to scrutinize any response actually carried out under these stacked threats, should one of these triggers eventually be crossed. A response justified as retaliation for an assassination attempt against a head of state invites a different level of international legal scrutiny than one justified as protecting freedom of navigation through an international shipping strait. Trump's decision to publicly link both categories of trigger to the same phrase, overwhelming force, may simplify his messaging domestically, but it also risks blurring the legal and political justification for whatever response eventually follows, making it harder for allies and international bodies to assess whether any specific American action was proportionate to whichever specific line was actually crossed. Let's zoom out further, because this stacking list of red lines does not exist in isolation from the broader map of this war. Gulf states, including Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, Jordan, and Qatar, have all reported incoming fire connected to this conflict in recent weeks, none of them the intended targets of the strikes that triggered it. Russia has quietly sent nuclear workers back to Iran's Bushehr facility, signaling continued long-term investment in Iran's nuclear infrastructure, even as the broader war intensifies. And Iran's own leadership remains in the middle of an unusually fragile wartime succession, with a supreme leader who has not appeared publicly since taking power, reportedly out of fear that any public appearance could invite exactly the kind of targeted strike Trump's own warnings now threaten more broadly. This is where the deeper danger of this specific moment comes into focus. Trump has now publicly stacked multiple distinct triggers, one another, each carrying the same promised response of overwhelming force. That approach can work as effective deterrence if Iran's leadership genuinely believes avoiding every one of these triggers is both possible and worthwhile. But it can also backfire badly if Iran's government concludes that avoiding all of these triggers simultaneously, keeping Hormuz open, preventing any infrastructure-adjacent incident, controlling every faction within its own military and intelligence services well enough to prevent any assassination attempt, while also satisfying its own domestic hardliners who demand visible defiance, is simply not achievable. A deterrent threat only changes behavior if compliance feels realistic. Stack enough conditions onto that threat, and compliance can start to feel impossible instead, removing much of the restraining power the warning was designed to have in the first place. Consider what happens next for each of the parties now factoring these overlapping threats into their own planning. For the United States, the challenge is credibility, having now issued multiple distinct warnings tied to overwhelming force. Failing to follow through decisively if any one of these lines is actually crossed risks undermining the deterrent value of every other warning still standing. For Iran's fractured wartime leadership, the challenge is survival, both political and literal, trying to avoid triggering an overwhelming American response, while still satisfying internal factions who view any visible restraint as unacceptable weakness at the exact moment their new leadership is trying to consolidate authority. For Gulf states already absorbing spillover from this conflict, the challenge is exposure, having no real ability to influence whether any of Trump's stated triggers get crossed, while remaining directly in the blast radius if they are. And for Israel, the challenge is timing, deciding whether its own declared readiness to re-engage should activate in coordination with an American overwhelming force response, or independently, on its own separate timeline, tied to threats against its own territory and interests. There is also the diplomatic track to consider, reportedly still continuing quietly through back channels, even as every one of these public threats escalates in parallel. Negotiators from both countries have reportedly continued engaging even after the ceasefire's public collapse, a reminder that stacking public warnings and continuing private diplomacy are not necessarily contradictory strategies. Trump may be using the threat of overwhelming force specifically to strengthen Washington's negotiating position, making clear the cost of continued Iranian escalation in the starkest possible terms, while leaving the door open for a genuine settlement if Tehran calculates that avoiding these triggers is ultimately worth returning seriously to the table. Now think about how each of these specific threats interacts with the American domestic political calendar as well, because none of this is unfolding in a political vacuum. With midterm elections just months away, and this war having remained unpopular with American voters since its earliest days, Trump's escalating list of red lines serves a dual purpose, projecting strength and resolve to a domestic audience increasingly frustrated by a conflict that keeps refusing to end, while simultaneously attempting to genuinely deter the specific behaviors, from further tanker attacks to assassination plots, that have kept dragging this war back toward full-scale confrontation every time it appears close to winding down. There's also a broader credibility question tied specifically to America's standing with allies well beyond the Gulf, because deterrent threats issued publicly and repeatedly, without eventual enforcement, carry costs that extend past this single conflict. NATO allies watching from Ankara, Pacific partners watching Beijing's response to any perceived American hesitation, and European governments already anxious about how thin Washington's attention has become across multiple simultaneous flashpoints, are all quietly assessing how consistently American threats translate into American action. Every one of Trump's stacked warnings toward Iran becomes, in that sense, a test case being watched far beyond the specific conflict it was aimed at, shaping how seriously future American red lines get taken in entirely separate regions of the world. Let's go back to where we started. A set of military plans, confirmed by the president himself to already exist, tied not to one single trigger, but to an entire stacking list of them: Hormuz, infrastructure, American bases, and his own life. Every one of these warnings carries the same three words attached: overwhelming force. Whether that phrase succeeds in finally forcing Iran's fractured wartime leadership to step back from every one of these lines simultaneously, or instead becomes the spark that turns this already sprawling regional war into something considerably larger. It may depend less on anything happening in Washington, and more on which faction inside Tehran's own government ends up making the next move. Thank you for watching. Please like this video and comment your thoughts below, so this analysis reaches more people who need to understand exactly how close this conflict is to a response the world has not seen before.